A few comments have been made recently about the fact that so much was made in terms of getting collaboration between G8 countries and African economies in terms of halving poverty, doubling aid, and creating a new agenda through the Nepad. Now the G8 seems to be falling by the wayside, and the G20 seems to be gaining in prominence, and the G20 doesn't seem to have any obligations to the Nepad in any way. Your views?
Yes, that's broadly true. But I think we need to be careful not to confuse institutional change, which of course we've had, with the much more important underlying massive changes in the global economy that have occurred in only in such a short time, in just 5 years. The commitments that were made in the early part of the century, the previous decade rather, the early part of the current century, those commitments were made by people who could not see round the corner and almost certainly did not envisage that within just a few years we would have gone from a situation where most of the world was buoyantly growing but Africa was seen to be falling backwards or not keeping up, to the current situation in which we find ourselves with rich countries suffering from anemic growth, fiscal crisis, and high unemployment, while most of the developing world, including a substantial part of Africa, is growing briskly. So the world of 2010 is very, very significantly different from the world of 2005.
Where does that put the Nepad agenda today? Because what we had in recent years is OECD countries pledging 0.7% of their GDP to go towards aid to Africa. The financial crisis has obviously thrown a spanner in the works, but is anybody even talking about the Nepad anymore?
Well, I think we also need to remember that events like the Gleneagles Pledge are at least, and always were, at least 70% political theater and 30% real economics, real macroeconomics. You know, people perhaps imagine that after a pledge like Gleneagles is made, leaders of rich countries sit down and hand checks to leaders of poorer countries. But of course that isn't how things work. There are many, many channels by which aid and other flows move from richer countries to poorer countries. Some of those channels are relatively directly controlled by governments, but the majority of them are not. And in fact, some of the least effective aid is that form of aid which flows directly from one government to another government. The effective kind of aid is aid which has to be carefully brokered through small projects and through governing committees, and project management becomes very complicated. So there's an awful lot of translation and process that lies between one politician or a group of politicians committing an amount of money and that money actually finding its way into projects in poorer countries. It was inevitable, and everybody who understands the way these processes work, it was inevitable that the flows were likely to be smaller and likely to take longer and likely to be less stable than the kinds of promises made in Gleneagles envisaged.
Okay,
it's also the case that Nepad on its side was relatively under-organized. Nepad was not ever in a situation to be able to handle and manage as a governance structure the kinds of quantities of money that were talked about in the middle of the last decade.
Now we know that with the global financial crisis, aid to Africa has dropped by about 1/5 or 17%, and probably if you quantified it into 2010, those figures are lower. And yet you have countries in Africa that are heavily dependent on aid, such as Tanzania, Mozambique, and Uganda. And they've also demonstrated incredible innovation in managing the economies through that aid to now be African countries that are growing above 6%, the estimated average being 4.5%. Where, you know, the falling aid flows, where does it put the growth trajectory of many African countries?
Well, I think there's, as many of your listeners or viewers are no doubt aware, there's been a very polarized debate over the last few years on the question of whether aid to Africa is a good thing or a bad thing. And you have had some commentators who have actually argued that aid harms Africa. And then there are, of course, other commentators like Jeffrey Sachs who have insisted that Africa needs massive expansion of its current aid. I think both poles are wrong. Aid is not the panacea that will grow Africa. And some of the rhetoric associated with Nepad recognize that to some extent, to a large extent, Africa needs to be the source of its own growth. It needs to find its own resources and its own governance improvements that could lead to growth. On the other hand, as your question recognized, there are some African countries which would find themselves in severe fiscal crises if their aid levels fell much further than they already have. Those countries, just like any other countries, will have ultimately to be the authors of their own growth. But of course, we don't want to see them drop off a cliff. The fiscal holes that would be left in their budgets if there were significant aid cuts could make it impossible for them to preserve the kind of stability they need to be able to exploit this window they find themselves in, where significant growth is possible, where the global conditions for significant growth have at last arisen for those countries.
Okay, I want to bring Jean-Francois into this conversation. With the growing prominence of G20, and within that G20, the growing prominence of Brazil, Russia, India, and China, and other emerging market economies, you can see that it's very difficult now to start saying to people, you're the colonizer, we are the previously oppressed. We need to prey on that relationship to talk about a new way in terms of economic management. Those sentiments don't exist, and consequently things like Nepad seem to not feature very prominently in those debates.
Yes, well, on the issue of the colonizer versus colonized, there are two things that one has to remember. First of all is the days of decolonization are getting further and further ago. Congo, for instance, DRC, celebrating 50 years of independence. It's half a century. A lot of these African countries now are independent for half a century. Of course, then you have the prominence of Asia, Latin America, countries which are also poor and have themselves managed to develop themselves. So there's a bit of pressure maybe in Europe, say, well, I mean, Africa has received a lot of aid from Europe, from the Western world. It hasn't worked.